to me, for vendors to make that choice for me by withholding information is really anti-customer. And so to me it became a consumer rights issue. This whole thing around security research became a consumer rights issue. And so I got really indignant and I learned all about the CFAA and the DMCA, and I went to the CEO of the company and I said, this is a huge problem. It's affecting our industry, but it's also affecting our society. And he said, you should go do something about that. And I looked at him and laughed and went, are you insane?
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the 401 Access Denied podcast. I'm Joe Carson, the host for the episode, Chief Security Scientist and Advisory CISO at Delinea. And it's a pleasure to be back. I'm really excited about today's episode because we have an awesome and amazing guest on the show. And today I am joined with Jen Ellis. So passing over to Jen. Jen, do you want to give us a bit of an introduction about who you are, what you do, and how you got into the industry?
Sure, and thank you for having me. It's great to be here. It's always nice to have a chance to nerd out with friends. I like it.
Absolutely.
I don't know how much other people want to listen to that, but I enjoy it. So yeah, so I'm Jen Ellis. I have a fairly unusual role in the security industry, I think. I sort of sit at the intersection of community, public policy, and sort of awareness. So my goal, if you will, is to create change, right?
Mhm.
I basically have a view that cybersecurity is a societal issue because connected technologies are in everything that we do. And
Absolutely.
so the risk that comes with connected technologies relates to everything that we do. And we've seen this play out massively in the past couple of years through the pandemic as we've
Mhm.
seen hospitals being attacked. And um, just last week, we saw the Royal Mail get attacked. We've
Mhm.
seen attacks against critical infrastructure sort of ramping up over the past several years. And so my question is like, how do you create change that reduces risk for everybody on a societal level rather than just being about reducing risk for those who can afford to buy solutions?
Absolutely.
And I think the answer to that is you have to create behavioral change amongst large scale like technology manufacturers, buyers, and operators. And so that's going to be a combination of like the top down,
Mhm.
which is where the public policy piece comes in, and then the bottom up, which is where that sort of groundswell of awareness and of peer to peer education and of standards
Mhm.
adoption all comes in. And I sit sort of in the middle of those things, trying to create connection points, I guess.
Yeah, in the
So yeah,
toughest part, the toughest
I
part
don't
of the industry.
I don't think so.
So,
I think I sit in the eye of the storm, right? So everything where I am is calm. Everything around me is chaos. It's definitely an interesting spot to sit in.
absolutely, and just to get so, I mean, absolutely for yourself. I mean, this is my always my favorite part of the week is recording these episodes. So
Oh
because
yeah,
it does
yeah,
get me to nerd out, it gets me to talk to great friends and people in the industry, and just also just kind of sometimes get different perspectives and things. Because
yeah.
when you're doing your in your own rut, you always get stuck in that kind of that continuous kind of feed. And for me, this is the greatest part of my week, where it's basically allowing me to just get a bit of the view from a different part of the world or a different part of the industry that I would typically
Yes.
normally do in my day job. So it's always one of my fun parts. And for me, so I've always been sitting. So in what you do, I've always been from the techie side of things in the
Yeah.
industry. And I remember, quite a few years ago, it's probably going back about 10 years ago, even before that, even late 2009 or so, I started getting involved in this little thing called GDPR and stuff like that, and compliance.
I've heard
And
of
so,
that. Yeah.
so and doing the technical reviews. And I was always kind of brought in from the technical side, not so much
Yep.
the policy side, but I did get a lot of exposure to those who are making decisions. And when I was looking at I never forget GDPR, because it was always one of those things where when it was trying to get 28 countries to work together
Oh
and
yeah.
come to the same conclusion.
Yeah.
And the moment you introduce many different countries and societies, it gets more complex
Yeah.
and more complex. So then I remember doing some policies and working with different governments and different agencies, and it was always a one-way street. It was always me sharing information and
Yeah.
then not hearing anything back. So can you tell me about some, you've been working a lot of these areas in advocacies
Yeah.
and bringing policies and bringing governments and industry together. Can you share some of the task force and things that you worked on that were
Yeah, sure. I
interesting?
mean, actually, like, so on the point that you're making, like, if I can go into story time a little bit and kind of
Mhm,
take a step back about how I ended up in policy, because I didn't start working in policy, and in fact, I don't think anybody would have predicted that this would have been where I would end up going, right? And for me, so I was living and working in the US. As you can probably tell from my accent,
mhm,
I'm a Brit, but I was living and working in the US for a security company,
mhm,
and I worked really closely with the research team. I had um, uh, helped champion and build a research function within Rapid 7.
mhm,
And there you go, Rapid 7 gets some free advertising. Um, and worked really, really closely with the researchers on, and they were doing technical research, right?
mhm,
Um, and then our then head of research got threatened with legal action for a piece of, it was port scanning research, and it
mhm.
was a legit project. I mean, we'd put out findings. We had a whois lookup that enabled you to opt out,
Mhm.
and we honored all opt out requests. It was as bona fide as a research project could look, right? And he
Yep.
got threatened with legal action for 3 months, and at the end of which he said, I'm glad that this has been dropped, but it took a huge toll, and I don't know how much I really want to do research anymore when I'm
Mhm.
dealing with this. And in the meantime, I had looked into it and found out that he wasn't the only one. That lots of researchers felt that this was the case, that they were getting threatened with legal action under either um, the U.S. anti-hacking law, which is the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, or a
You could
state
say, yeah.
equivalent of said
Mhm.
anti-hacking law, or the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, the DMCA. And so one of these things was being used basically to frighten off a lot of researchers
Mhm.
and threaten them. And I kind of started to really think about it. And it's interesting you say that you come from the technical point of view, and I really don't, right? Like
Mhm.
I have a really strong passion for the intersection of technology and society, but I'm not particularly technical myself,
Mhm.
and which I know is a huge crime in security, and I apologize sincerely.
It is
Uh,
not. I want to make it. Was it? It's not. I mean,
it
I
certainly can be.
on social media. Yes, I think that the infosec social media community do come harsh on those who may not have a technical background. But you don't need a technical. You don't need to be a
I think it
developer. You
depends
don't
how
need to
you're
be a technical.
applying yourself, right? And what
It
you're
depends how
claiming
you're applying.
ownership and knowledge
Absolutely.
of.
I
But yeah,
mean,
so
we need to be better at communication.
so I complete I can
And that's
100% agree, 100%
so.
agree. So I was thinking about this, and I sort of ended up in this view
Mhm,
that security research to me obviously is fundamental to the research community, right? It underpins everything that we do. It underpins all of our
mhm,
knowledge. But I think it's actually a way bigger issue than that. Because here's my view is that I may not be super technical, but I have every right to make an informed decision to
mhm,
manage my risk and to balance how much risk matters to me compared to other things. So, like
mhm.
when I'm buying a new phone, I might go, I really care about the best camera, or I might go, I really care about having the same platform as all of my family so that we can
Yep.
integrate things. But I might go, what I really care about more than anything is not being put at risk and not having my
Mhm.
data shared or being hackable, and that informs the choices I make over which phone I buy. To
Yep.
me, for vendors to make that choice for me by withholding information is really anti-customer. And so to me it
Mhm.
became a consumer rights issue. This whole thing around security
Yep.
research became a consumer rights issue. And so I got really indignant, and I learned all about the CFAA and the DMCA, and I went to the CEO of the company and I said, this is a huge problem. It's affecting our industry, but it's also affecting our society. And he said, you should go do something about that. And I looked
Mhm.
at him and laughed and went, are you insane? And I was like, so number one, I'm not a lawyer. Number two, I've
Mhm.
never done anything on policy before. And number three, I'm British and I don't know how the US law system works. And like, he looked at me and he
Mhm.
said, is it the right thing to do? And I was like, yeah. And he's like, then you should go do it. And so I went off, and I don't know if you've ever seen that Family Guy episode where Peter goes
Mhm.
to Washington D.C. and he ends up working with a smoking lobbyist, and he's like in his dress with his little hat and he's doing twirlies. I basically was that. I was like in DC, like wide-eyed, innocent, going to these government buildings, had no idea what the hell I was doing, getting lost everywhere I went, and um and I went and met with staffers on
Mhm.
Capitol Hill, and they would say to me, it's so fantastic to meet you. You're the first person we've ever spoken to from the security community. And I would be sat there going, like, if you go to congress.gov and you put in cybersecurity, then the list of bills that get returned that have some cybersecurity component in them, and I'd be like, you guys are actively legislating on cybersecurity. And this is back in the days when they were
Mhm.
trying to pass the Cyber Information Sharing Act, CISA
Yep.
2015, right?
Mhm.
Um, and and I said, like, you're actively working on encryption backdoors and hackback and prosecution authorities and cyber information
Mhm.
sharing and breach notification and cyber hygiene. And you're not talking to people in the security industry. Like, who are you talking to? And they said, oh, well, we hear from the banks and
Mhm.
we hear from the defense contractors, and we hear from big tech, but
Mhm.
we don't hear from the security players at all. And I was horrified, horrified.
Yes.
And
Well,
so it became a
obviously,
mission for me,
yeah.
you
It's not a
know?
bit it's not a bit shocking because a lot of infosec people are like, they're always concerned about, how much they interact with the government because some of the things
Sure.
that they're doing. So there's always
Yeah.
that wall that they've
Yeah.
built up over years. So,
Completely
but
agree.
it's needed to come down. That wall has
It
needed
has,
to
it
be
has.
demolished. So,
And so, like that clock, if you look at that, was probably like 9 or 10 years ago now,
mhm.
right? I don't know, because the weird vacuum of time that was the pandemic means I feel like I stopped counting before the pandemic and I haven't started counting again. But yeah, so it was probably like 9 or 10 years ago. And then uh since then, the 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 landscape has changed so
Mhm.
hugely. So at that time, we really didn't have a lot of nonprofits that were doing anything around cybersecurity. And when I say nonprofits, in this sense, what I'm talking about is like the kind that interact with
Mhm.
governments. So you have trade associations and you have think tanks and you have
Yep.
research divisions and you have, all sorts of civil society. And there were very few that were really doing anything about cybersecurity. A few that had like focused on privacy were doing a little bit
Mhm.
here and there. The EFF, who I know are very beloved in the security community,
Yep.
they were doing little pockets, but like they don't lean forward as policy engagement being their number one thing. Although I think they were a bit more
Mhm.
active back then, maybe. Um, and so now, fast forward the clock to now, there's actually quite a few of them. It is
Mhm.
quite a big sector. And one part of that was that the Hewlett Foundation,
Mhm.
what are they? What's their full name? No, it's not. It's not flowing out of my mouth right now. I'll have to think about what they're called. But they're a bit like, if people are familiar with the Gates Foundation, they're like that,
Yep.
right? They're a huge
Mhm.
endowment, and they find sort of worthy causes to give money to, and they created a endowment specifically for cybersecurity. They said, like, for
Mhm.
this number of years, we're going to fund projects that help advance security on a societal level. And so that meant that a lot more nonprofits could start kind of engaging in
Mhm.
it. And that's helped with what I would call kind of like the democratization of cybersecurity, because before
Yep.
that, the way that governments talked about it, it was all about national security. And national
Mhm.
security, as we know, tends to be something that gets talked about behind closed doors in
Yep.
very closed groups. It's very invitation only.
Or classified. It's all classified.
Exactly.
It's not for
100%.
public view.
No,
You had to go through a whole procedure to be able to get involved or see any of the data.
absolutely.
So it's not something that works on a civilian
No,
level.
exactly.
So it's very kind of,
Yeah.
let's say, behind the closed doors, as you mentioned. You don't get to see it.
Right. And then I think a few different things happened. So one, there was a massive upscale in the level of cybercrime.
Yep.
And that made it something that people had an awareness of. It was something they saw in headlines. It affected their lives. And so that moved it into a sort of civilian domain much more as something that
Hmm.
people talked about. It also meant that governments had to start thinking much more about, how are we going to respond to this and what are we going to do. There was a prediction that I saw last year that cybercrime was going to cost the global economy last year alone $7 trillion.
Yep.
And to put that into context, the GDP of the UK is about 2.6.
Yep. It's bigger than
So
many countries.
yeah, it's
Even
insane. It's
there's.
insane. And so, like, um governments had to respond, right? They
Mhm.
had to come up with a response. And in that year of of 2021, when we'd already had such a
Hmm.
such a terrible year the year before.
The one
um
that didn't exist, the one that we can't remember.
Right, exactly. I feel the same way about 20 and 21. But we had that run of
Mm,
like Colonial, and then 2 weeks later HSE, and then a week
mm,
after that JBS. And so within a month you had three of the biggest, most high profile
yeah.
attacks, ransomware attacks against national critical infrastructure, or not national, but critical infrastructure
Supply
providers.
chains, very, very big supply chains, which,
Exactly.
you have this domino effect. Is once one's impacted, everything that's
Oh yeah.
downstream can no longer do business or function.
100%. And then we
So,
had Kaseya
mm,
maybe like, I don't know, 2 months later. And so, I think what we've seen over the past few years is a huge sort of shift in how we talk about this stuff and how governments
mhm,
approach it. But what still happens is there's an access problem. And we exist in echo chambers, right? We talk about this a
yeah.
lot in security, because I think in security people are quite aware of it. Like,
Yeah,
w-
we're
we
used to working in silos. That's that
we
we have
well,
these, we work in our own little silo as long as it doesn't impact everything else. Because in
yeah,
the background, we were techies. We like communicating with technology and not so much people.
I think that's
So,
true. I think that's true. But I will say, like, I've worked in a lot of
yeah.
sectors of B2B tech,
Mhm,
and I've never worked in a sector that is such a community as this.
mhm.
Right. And actually, when we say that, what we actually mean is it's multiple communities layered over the top of each other, right? There's like
Yes.
the threat intel community and the pen testing community, and
Mhm,
there are, there's blue team and purple team and red team, and they all sort of layer on top and mix together.
mhm.
But it is a community. I have never seen a B2B tech sector that has as many events in its annual calendar as security. Security people, for people who exist online, security people love to get together in person. Love it.
Yep.
Absolutely love it. And I mean, and as a community, we may have a certain reputation for partying hard, and that might factor into why people like it. But I don't just think it's that. I think it's also the fact that people who work in cybersecurity, often it's a real passion, and
Yep.
that ability to come together and learn from each other, and do what we're doing right now, which is just nerd out together and exchange,
Mhm,
war stories, I think is just a really big thing for people in security to do. And so we have this really amazing, super
mhm.
active community, but it's an echo chamber. It's
Yep.
a bubble, and we all sit in it, and actually the government sector is its own bubble. It's a whole
Mhm,
other bubble. It's a whole other echo chamber. And so when the government comes to being like in a position where they've got to create policy on something, they know that they need to talk to experts. They know that. They actually want to talk to experts, but they actually don't know how to break into the echo chamber. And because we are so bombarded with messages every day, we also don't really know what to pay attention to go, okay, that's the thing I should respond to.
mhm.
And we don't know how to break into the government echo chamber. So you've got these like bubbles. I'm like now describing them as if we're basically sort of terraforming Mars and we're living in our bubbles. And that's a little bit what it's like, right? It's like we're all trying to do the same thing and work together towards a common goal, but we're sitting
Mhm,
in these bubbles and we don't actually know how to reach each other's bubbles. And I think that's where things like, task forces or working groups or policy groups can really be helpful. I think some of the events that we have
mhm,
in the sector can help give people access. We had um, we had the Department of Digital Culture, Media and Sport, which is the UK
mhm.
ministry that basically sets public policy around cybersecurity. We sort of call them the any other business ministry, because they cover such a wide range of things. Which, by the way, if you're trying to follow what they're putting out about
Mhm,
cybersecurity, super hard, right? Because you go to their website and you got to wade through museums and theatre and sports,
mhm.
and then even when you get to tech, you got to wade through like you know 15 internet things and
Yeah.
AI and quantum before you get to cybersecurity. Not that those topics aren't relevant, they are, but
Yeah.
they're not necessarily going to be focused on security. So it's actually really hard to kind of keep up with what they're doing. But DCMS came to Black Hat Europe
Mhm,
in December, and they gave a talk, like a sort of a 101 on here's what's happening in policy and how you can get involved. And I think those kinds of opportunities, those kinds of moments are
mhm.
super, super powerful. And they give people the opportunity to create those relationships or start creating them. DEF CON did the
Yeah.
same thing last summer. They had this policy at DEF CON track.
Yeah.
and they had people from all over the world come
And they've
and
been
talk
doing it
about
slowly. At
privacy.
DEF CON has been great because they've started. It all started, of course, with the voting
Yes.
machines. They started bringing in the voting machines. They started having actually senators and in Congress speaking
I will
at the
say
event as
actually it
well.
started before the voting village.
Uh,
It started way before the voting village,
mm, so
having the govies come over. And there have been some
attending
really,
in person, yes, yeah.
yeah, there, I mean, because like, I think Congressman Langevin, who
Mm,
is retiring and who we are all going to miss desperately because he's been an
mm,
incredibly positive force for
mhm,
cybersecurity in Congress in the US. He has now been out to DEF CON a
mhm,
few times, and I think the first time that he came, he actually did a trip with Will Hurd.
mhm,
Um, and I think that was sort of organized, I think, at the time by the Atlantic Council. And so they've been
mhm,
these pockets of activity and opportunity, but now we're seeing a sort of much greater build up of momentum and groundswell. And I
mhm.
think I honestly still think we've got a way to go. There's still so much more that can be done to kind
Yeah,
of create those connection points, because I think the vast majority of people who are listening to this podcast are probably thinking like, I've got no idea how to get involved. Um,
yeah.
and so we have to change that.
I remember my first involvement was, I did a lot of advisory. So from my kind of background in what I did with previous companies, that I would get a lot of government agencies coming in asking for technical advice
Yeah,
or architecture design.
yeah,
So whether it was to do with patch management or whether it was to do with vulnerability assessments or to do with migration processes and so forth. And they would come. And my always thing was that I would, I wouldn't know how it was being used or where it was intended to be used. They
yeah,
just come in and say, with these limitations of scope that I was allowed to be informed about,
yeah.
I would provide my expertise back. It was
And then you'd hear nothing
I'd
back.
hear nothing. For me, it was when you were actually talking
Yeah,
about these little bubbles. It just got me thinking about it's almost like the movie Contact, where I've sent these signals out into space, and I'm sitting here with my satellite dish waiting for responses back. And years go by, and I never hear a thing. And
yeah,
you get to the point where it's like, was I helpful? Did I did I because we always want the feedback. We want to know what we
yep,
did it
yep,
was it adding value? And that
yep,
happened for so often. And I think I remember there was an event I attend this kind of the CERT events where
yep,
it's all about instant response, and you hear what worked and what didn't work, and we hear some of the major incidents. And it
yep,
was the first time I remember we had a round table. It was law enforcement and it was ethical research, security researchers, and hackers, all on the
yep,
same team. And that was the
yep,
first time where we started having back and forward interaction, where we started hearing what they were proposing. And it was the first thing, and it was probably around 2014, I think, at that
yep,
point. And I think that's where I started seeing slow changes happening, where we
yeah.
started having much more communication. And to the point, one of the things that, I think the last time I met with Chris Krebs, I think it was maybe RSA last year.
This
And I
is
said to him,
Director Krebs, former director of
direct,
the
former
CISA.
director Krebs from CISA. And I was, because that was the first time when Chris went into CISA
Yeah,
and established CISA was it was the first time I started seeing bi-directional communication,
yeah.
and it was first time we started seeing communication proactively coming
So
out.
it depends, right? It depends on the
Mm,
government you look at. So when Chris went in, uh, so so CISA was born out of what was MPPD, right? At DHS. For those who don't spend all their time talking to governments, yes, they really like alphabet soup. So I'm not going to be able to remember what MPPD stood for. It was something like something Protectorate. I don't know.
yeah,
But it became CISA, which is the
mm,
critical infrastructure, no, cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency, and
yes.
as part of the Department of Homeland Security in the US, right? And MPPD um, becoming CISA happened, I want to say in about 2018
It was
ish.
around 2018. Yeah, it was around. It was not long after the elections,
Right.
the 26th. So yeah.
And not super long before that
Mm,
was when NCSC, the National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK, was formed, right?
again,
Where
yeah.
the UK basically said, we've got all these different parts of us dealing with
Hmm.
security, and we're going to kind of pull together and centralize it under this one organization, NCSC. And one of NCSC's core tenets has always been transparency,
Hmm.
which is hilarious, right? Because they come out of GCHQ.
Yeah.
And so that I think is actually why they made it like this is a core tenant for us. Is like we don't want to have the reputation that
Mhm.
GCHQ has of being about secrets. That's a reputation they necessarily have, but we don't sit in the same spot. And so
Mhm.
we're going to be transparent about what we're seeing and how things are going and that kind of thing. And I think a really big part of the reason they did that was because when NCSC started, they identified 16 core areas of activity,
Mhm.
and
Yep.
basically the private sector was involved in every single one of them, right? They basically were able to execute and move quickly through partnerships with the private sector,
Mhm.
and everything that they were doing involved that. And so they kind of had this view of like, well, if we're partnering with you, we have to tell you how things are going. We have to share that
Mhm.
information with you.
Yep.
And actually, we live in a democratic nation. We represent the people. We should share that information broadly, and we should improve the general level of knowledge in the security community.
Yep.
When
And that's how you
Chris
build.
came
That's how
in,
you build trust.
it
That's the
is
whole
how you build trust.
foundation. It's the whole
And
foundation of trust.
trust is
So.
something that is massively lacking between
Mhm.
the public and private sectors in the US, where there has been a
Yes.
sort of cultural norm of the private sector not trusting the government. I think you can actually date it back to when, they were paying taxes to the British government, right? So, like, they've
Yeah.
never really got past this view that you can't trust the government. And so, whether they're an overseas government or an in country government. And so, Chris, I think, when he started, had a strong point of view of like one wanting to be able to build
Mhm.
that trust and build that collaboration
Yes.
because he recognized the value of it. And so he, I think, paid very close attention to what NCSC was doing
Mhm.
and what was working and what wasn't, and started to, and I'm not saying like, one of the things that Chris and I talked about a lot, and I've talked to
Mm.
various people at NCSC about a lot as well, is that you can't really compare CISA and NCSC because
Yeah.
it is an apples to oranges comparison. What the UK deals with in terms of scope and scale is considerably less complex than what the
Yeah.
US is dealing with.
And you're not having to deal with the multiple states legislation across
Exactly,
it, because
right?
that gets a whole level of complex. You've got a federal side, which is one thing, but when you have to deal with states and local level, that
Right.
changes the whole
And I
thing.
mean,
In the UK, you don't have to deal with that. So.
no, and you are talking about a population of
Mm.
sort of 70-ish million versus I think 320 million or something.
Three, it's around just over 300 million. Yeah.
And so, like, that's a pretty, pretty huge
It's,
difference in terms of scale. And then this relationship with the private sector was a hugely
mhm.
significant difference. And I think, what's interesting is if you look at those years, you've seen NSA launch a public-private partnership scheme.
Mhm.
You've seen CISA's actually really, really lent into it. So even CISA post Krebs has continued to do that leaning in
Mhm.
on how you build that, and has built various schemes that involve the private sector working with the government. And I think we will see more of these develop over time. I think it's really
Yeah.
important that we do. They are very
E-
valuable.
Yeah, even the FBI, I've seen a lot of
Yeah,
corporation FBI, and which is surprised. I remember meeting with, I doing all some of the events, and we cooperate together, and we exchange, and it was their view was that we've struggled to do this because the FBI is so used to asking questions and listening,
yeah,
and not so much
yeah,
sharing,
yeah,
and of course that's even within states within different
yeah,
departments and stuff, that's always been a challenge, and they're now getting to the point where it's a whole different type of culture that they're also it's a cultural change for them to also
yeah.
start actually communicating and having bi-directional communication. And I think scissor really kind of was the step up, and were they going to look to that direction as a kind of one that was kind of making those steps. But I think they're slowly coming around. I think it's a great thing because it's how we build. It's going back to that trust side of things. It's how you build the trust and how you know that value is being created.
Yeah. I mean, I think in order to be able to do that, you need to have a sea change at the very top to say that this kind of sharing is okay. And I think actually, if you go back to before, because remember that Scissor started in 2018, but the groundwork that was laid to create Scissor started far earlier, right? And
Mm-hmm.
and so actually, you can trace it back to the Obama administration and some of the changes that were made through the National Security Council and
Mm-hmm.
the recommendations that came out of that White House around how you create better partnership. Um, and it's interesting to me that even though the Trump administration massively downsized the level of investment
Mm-hmm.
in cybersecurity and took away various roles
Mm-hmm.
in the White House administration around cybersecurity, that the good work continued, and it is through the leadership of people like Chris Krebs and
Yeah.
others. Um, So
Is
yeah,
it
I
is
think
it
it's good
important?
for
Yeah,
initiative.
to your point, from a leadership perspective, I know that Estonia has been doing this for many years. We've had
I know
a
Estonia's amazing.
CIO and we've had a
Yeah.
digital. So they've been looking. They've always had somebody who was the central person who would coordinate everything and have that. It's always been about transparency and communicating with the citizens and making sure that the public was informed. And I've seen other countries starting to have some type of security leadership. Of course, they've had the advisors and stuff in the White House. Is it really time to have somebody like a CIO type of role that every government should have that allows them to have more coordination between multiple agencies? Is it something that we need to have? Or is that just kind of
I
giving
think
somebody
so.
too much complication?
Well, it's not that. It's just that the challenge I have is I've never met an organization that defines the role CIO the same, let
Mm,
alone a government that does it, right?
yeah.
The US actually has CIOs. The the British government, I believe, has CIOs,
Mm.
but they are treated as very much operational roles, not
Not from a
policy
security and the
roles,
policy
right?
side. Yeah.
And so it depends what you're trying to achieve by having
Mhm.
that role. I think if what you're talking about is like a cyber czar,
A
then
cyber czar is what I'm more referring to. Somebody who's
so I
more.
think that exists in various different places in various
Mm,
different roles, right? Like so, this year, not this year because we're now in a new year.
yeah.
I'm still in the time vortex. Last year we saw, and actually now that I say I'm in the time
Mm,
vortex, it might not even be last year, but I think it was last year. We saw the introduction of uh, the Office of the National Cyber Directorate, right? And we
mhm,
saw the introduction of the Cyber Directorate role, which is basically a cyber czar.
mhm.
And so that's Chris Inglis
Yes. Yeah.
at the moment. And I don't think it's a big secret that he's planning on exiting,
Mm.
and so it'll be someone else soon. But Chris is there right now, and they only hire Chris's to work on security at senior levels in government. But yeah, so I think, and I think when you look at the Obama administration, he had a couple of people who
Mm,
had very, very senior roles. So Michael Daniel was one who was his chief sort of advisor and sat on NSC,
mhm.
the National Security Council. There is a question about what ONCD and NSC, how they go together or how they differ.
Mhm.
And I think the White House is still figuring out exactly how to answer that question in a very crisp, articulate way.
Okay.
And some of it, I think, will be revealed by what the new um, national cyber strategy that they're working on, that they're going to bring
Mhm.
out, will be. I can give you my very rough explanation. I
Absolutely. Yeah,
mean,
that simplifies
NSC
it
is
for us.
not focused on
Mm,
cybersecurity purely.
mm.
They are the National Security Council, so they cover any topic relating to national security that
Mhm.
needs to be focused on or looked at from a White House level, right? That incredibly
Yeah.
senior level, and they advise the president on it. Um, the ONCD is specifically focused on
Mhm.
cybersecurity. And so you can expect that they will work very, very, very much hand in hand. But
Mhm.
ONCD should I think be the ones that go super deep, and then they advise NSC. Um, and then there's also questions about how ONCD sits separately to CISA. I would say
Mhm.
CISA's focus is mainly critical infrastructure piece, but
Yeah.
also CISA is very operational, right? They're about doing things to take action to protect,
Yeah.
right? Either by driving better preparedness and awareness.
Yeah, even the best practices for ransomware and some of the
Exactly.
major
Right.
vulnerabilities, they become
Exactly.
almost like the alerts for CVEs now.
Right, the KEV list, right? The
Yes.
known exploited vulnerabilities list,
Yeah.
which if you guys are working in
Mm,
cybersecurity and you're not aware of KEV, go check it out. Known exploited
mm.
vulnerabilities. It's getting longer and longer. Start
Yeah.
now. Um, but they're looking at, and they offer free services for certain types
Mhm.
of organizations. So they're really looking at the operational piece with a heavy focus on critical infrastructure, whereas
Mhm.
ONCD is sort of across everything on a strategy level. Um, and it it's a big old government, right? They have lots of
Yeah.
different
So
pockets of
so
things.
so would they
They
be
all work
looking at
together.
some? Yeah. So would they be looking at something similar to what, for example, the EU came out with, basically about the ratings for cybersecurity for certain IoT devices,
Right.
such as also what you have in the UK, where they were coming out with the policy about not having default weak credentials as
Right,
part
right,
of
right.
Is that what they would
Yeah,
be responsible
so,
for, or?
yeah, yes and no. So, uh, the way that in the US it works is if you are looking at creating policy,
Mhm.
you're looking at Congress. Congress creates
So
legislation,
they could
right?
legislate the law. They just
And then, right,
yeah.
they create the law, right? But then you can have laws that basically get created by Congress that then say X entity is responsible for figuring out the details, right?
Hmm.
And you see this happen. So, like, for example, the US passed a law called the IoT Cybersecurity Improvement Act.
Hmm.
And what it was basically doing was saying, hey, we recognize there's a lot of risk around IoT. We want to be able to change things. We're going to use the immense buying authority that the US government has as a huge entity and say that if you are a US government entity, when you buy IoT, you have to look for certain things.
Hmm.
And because we want the law to stay up to date and not time out really quickly, and because
Yes.
we recognize that as Congress, we're not experts in this, what we're going to say is that NIST they are going NIST, who are basically the president's advisors on like the very
Yeah.
technical aspects of what should be done. They're
Defining the
standards
standards.
bodies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Standards. Yeah.
That NIST is going to come out with the what it is and they're responsible for keeping it updated, what it is
Hmm.
that these government entities should be looking for. But we as Congress will pass the law that says governments have to do this, right?
Hmm.
And so uh so you've got two areas. You've got Congress passes like new law. You've got then specific sectoral or relevant agencies that have a specific role who then can help with the regulation. So say that
Hmm.
you are the FDA, right?
Yep.
You are in charge of coming out with what the requirements are for medical device security pre
Hmm.
and post market. um, and so you've got those bits. And then the last area is the White House and its administration can issue rules within the framework that already exists. So that's where you get
Hmm.
executive orders, right? Executive orders can't
Yes.
pass new laws, but they can leverage what already exists. And part of that also means that you get like CISA can do something like they can issue something called a binding operational directive, a BOD. And
Hmm.
that basically is them saying, we, as the cybersecurity sort of guardians, operational guardians, can go to any civilian federal agency and say, you must do X, you must have a
Hmm.
coordinated vulnerability disclosure program, you must have DMARC. These are all
Hmm.
things that we
Yep.
have seen. One of the ones they're working on at the moment is around supply chain, right? They pushed
Hmm.
that out a while back, and now we're seeing some of the stuff come out from it. So that's sort of how the structure works there, but it differs country by country, right? And
Yep.
in who does what. In the UK, it's a different setup. Um,
Hmm.
and I think the key here is to make sure that you always have. I think you always want to have the people who are creating the policy, the people who are in the government as like the technical leads, and then the third like branch needs to
Hmm.
be the people who work with this stuff day in day out, either engaging directly or through advocacy initiatives like
Yep.
task forces or nonprofits or whatever it
Yeah,
is.
which is one of the next things we're going to ask. All of this is cross country, and
Yeah.
cyber crimes are. That's the thing is when we work in cybersecurity, it's not within the national borders.
No.
Very seldom do you get criminals basically operating. You may
Yeah.
get certain elements of it. Doing like tax fraud and credit card fraud,
Yeah.
because of course that has to have some local element at some point. But when you get into things like ransomware, which is almost always cross border, that you're dealing with criminals in other countries
Yeah.
where it may not be considered a crime in these countries. And one of the things, when I also look at things like the complications as well, is similar to EU. One of the things that what tends to happen is, for example, the EU AI Act, which is all about the artificial intelligence acceptable use and so forth, and policies and strategies. That in Talent, we have the Talent Digital Summit, which is every year, which is then all countries coming together. And what I end up finding is a lot of cases, whatever country has taken the most progress in those policies, that everyone else is coming. They want to hear, can you share the policies with us? And they just clone them and modify them slightly to
Yeah.
work in their own society. So sometimes it accelerates it when you have some of those corporations and they're willing to share the policies.
Yeah.
and allow them to be modified. But it seems that how is things like the
But
Joint
we
Ransomware Task Force working?
I mean, but the thing is, right, we want to see this happen
Mhm.
because what you don't want what we want to support is a continuation or expansion of the global digital economy, right? Because it
Yep.
actually benefits everybody and it allows countries that have traditionally perhaps had a harder time creating
Mhm.
opportunity to create opportunity. So we want to see this continue. And in which case, for global entities doing business around the world, they don't want to have 57 different things that
Yeah.
they have to learn about, right? Like in the US, there are 57 different breach notification rules for each of the states and territories. Great that everybody has one. And actually, for the most part, the core elements are very similar,
And you end
but they're
up choosing
just
the most.
different enough that you have to like go and look at all of them, or
Oh,
at least look at each one for the areas where you operate. And wouldn't a federal one be nice because then it would stop that from having to happen? So,
absolutely.
so we have the same thing right in Europe where
Mm.
we have this huge complexity over having multiple member states. There's a difference between a
Mhm.
directive versus a regulation.
Yes.
Directives
Hmm.
are open to interpretation in country, whereas regulations aren't.
Yeah.
So there's a whole level of complexity there. You had mentioned earlier on about the UK IoT
Mm.
thing. And what was interesting with that was, yes, the UK developed a code of practice for consumer IoT,
Hmm.
and it's 13 principles that are, I think, they're pretty common sense principles
Yeah.
for those who work in security and spend a lot of time on it. Like it doesn't feel like a huge overreach to me. It feels like these are very solid principles. So after the UK developed that, they went and worked with ETSI, which is a European standards body,
Yeah.
and they took those principles, the 13, and they basically built them out and refined them and talked more about how you would do them. And they then made it what's called an EN. So it's
Hmm.
ETSI EN um, Jesus. 303465 or 645. I numbers are hard.
They're so
Um,
they're always so similar, so you always
yeah,
kind of mess
right.
them up into something else.
And what the EN means is that
Mm.
basically each of the member countries of the European Union basically then takes it on board in some way and
And
uses
they
it moving
ratify it
forward,
in
right?
some kind of
Right.
local version, depending on what
Right.
laws. Well, yeah.
So then, as the EU looks at building legislation, they have this standard now that is it's a voluntary right. Etsy's a
Mm.
voluntary, but they have it to look at and to draw on. And then what happened with that was India adopted it,
Hmm.
and then Australia adopted it. Now the UK has actually built the Product Security and Telecoms Infrastructure Act on top of
Hmm.
it, where they're not going to take all 13 principles, but they're taking the first three. As you said, one of them is don't use universal default passwords.
Yeah.
Um, and so you see these things sort of propagate, right? And that's
Hmm.
what you want to have
Yep.
happen because it actually does simplify the situation for those who are trying to adhere to them, but also do business internationally. So it's very good.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry, you asked about the task force, and you've asked me a couple of times, and
Mm.
I keep diverting. Um, yeah, so we formed the ransomware task force in at the end of 2020 because we were
Mhm.
sitting around, and after we'd all learnt to make bread and our own cheese, we thought, what should we do next? I honestly don't know who these people are who had time to do that stuff, but
Mm.
I'm very envious of them. In any case, uh, actually, what happened was that the Institute for Security and Technology, which is a West Coast think tank in the
Mhm.
US, sits on the sort of intersection of technology and national security when there's a lot of ransomware attacks against
Mm.
hospitals, and I don't know if people know, but there's a pandemic. And so they basically went, that elevates this to being on a level of national security,
Yep.
right? And they said, something needs to be done because what we're doing isn't working. And so they said, we're going to create this task force. And what was really savvy is they looked, if you think about the timing, they looked at the
Mhm.
situation, they said, we've had a new administration come in this year. They've had their hands really full with everything going on. But in spring of next year, they've already signaled that they want to do more on cybersecurity, which is not
Mhm.
hard because the bar had been set very low. Um, and in spring of next year, they're going to be looking at what they should set as their priorities. And if we can get a set of recommendations to them in their hands at that point, then we've got a chance of them looking at them and factoring
Mhm.
them into their thinking. So they pulled together, like the guy Phil Reiner who put it together, pulled together,
Mhm.
a group of 100 of his closest friends, and it focused on four main work streams. So how do you deter and disrupt ransomware attackers? And how
Hmm.
do you how do you help organizations prepare for and respond at scale? So this
Yeah.
isn't about issuing the advice to, like, hey, you should use multi-factor and you should have offline backups, right? This is about what governments can do. It was all about advice
Hmm.
for governments. And the task force, I Michael Daniels said in the launch that we had all sprinted a marathon, and it did feel like for all of us like
Hmm.
we had a whole other job, like full-time job, while we were doing it,
Yeah.
because we created the thing in a sort of 3-month window. But we came out with these 48 recommendations aimed at governments around the
Hmm.
world, and it just so happened, completely coincidental, the report landed, and a week later Colonial happened. And as we've already talked
Hmm.
about, Colonial
Yeah.
HSE, right? It, like, boom, boom,
It
boom.
was a whole kind of domino effect at that time, and
Yeah,
it was where, of course, criminal organizations had started kind of, and ransomware as a service, and you had a
yeah,
lot more, let's say, criminal organizations out there who were moving into software crime,
yeah,
and basically, hiring groups of engineers in order to get, some type of, financial kind of participation in the ransomware side. And a lot of organizations have very much depended, as their digital transformation, have very much dependent on digital in order to conduct their business.
yeah.
And absolutely, the impact is so severe. I mean, interestingly, last year has been a more quieter year, I would say. From my side in this response, I've seen a bit of decline. I don't know if it's to do with sanctions or to do with devalue of cryptocurrencies in some regards, um,
If you want my
or
opinion, and my opinion is unpopular because everybody would like to declare
yeah.
this a victory, but I think it's got a lot more to do with Russia invading Ukraine than it has with anything else.
That's also my opinion as well. Is I believe that where Russia is a safe haven for many criminal gangs, and they have
So was
been.
Ukraine.
Yep. So and
And
Ukraine as well.
a lot of their hackers are busy with other things right now. And
Yep.
actually, but it's not just the fact that their hackers are busy with other things. It's also the fact that, I don't want to sound
Mm,
hyperbolic,
mm,
but we actually do kind of stand on the precipice of the potential for there to be a pretty major war, right?
mhm,
And actually, in that context, you have to remember that one of the biggest things that allowed these groups to thrive for so long
mhm,
was the fact that the governments that they operated under either couldn't prosecute them or
mhm.
didn't, because
It benefited them.
it benefited them. It furthered their political aims, right? Now
Because
you
it's the cyber mercenaries. It's the
right,
cyber is
absolutely,
when basically you're holding on on a leash,
yeah,
and ultimately, you're allowing them to carry criminal activities and be financially rewarded for it. You might even getting paybacks. You might be
yeah,
getting financial back, payment for that. But ultimately, when you want something done for you, you then basically you're giving them, campaigns to carry out. And this is where, the whole cyber mercenaries things is, we know that a lot of those well-known criminal, ransomware gangs have been also carrying out other activities as well, whether giving
right. So
access or
and
so
so if you
forth.
think about, if you think about the run up to the invasion, right? At the same time that we were seeing,
Mhm.
tanks amass at the border, we were also seeing Biden say to Putin, "You got to stop attacking our critical infrastructure or else." And
Yeah.
he delivered that message not once but multiple times.
Hmm.
And then we saw this thing where, like, Russia made some arrests around Reval and there was some takedowns,
It was a
and we don't
PR. It was a
we
PR
don't believe,
show.
yeah, we don't believe that. But here's the thing: the reason it matters isn't
Mm.
because it's going to meaningfully change the landscape.
Mhm.
You're right; they were scapegoats.
Yep.
They were sacrificial lambs. It isn't because it's meaningfully changing the landscape. It's because of what it's signaling about the fact that Russia wanted to demonstrate that it was willing to play ball, right?
Mhm.
Which shows that actually the attacks against Western infrastructure has a perception uh, place, right? Like it
Mhm.
plays in the way that the dialogue around these attacks was developing. And so I
Mhm.
think, when you're in a situation where escalation can happen through just sort of shoddy execution, and escalation can be profoundly impactful, then I think you say to people, hey, what you're doing, maybe focus a little bit more on Latin America for the time being,
Yeah.
and not so much on people who are part of NATO.
Mhm.
And that's what we've seen, right? We've seen a massive upscale in the level of attacks against Latin America,
Yeah.
and
Costa Rica was the big one, but they had I think it was the pension scheme that was hit, if I remember. Um,
their not just the
yeah.
pension scheme, they
Yeah.
got absolutely hammered.
Hmm.
And it has massively impacted them. But I mean, not just them. Like, I was at an event the other day, and there was a chap there from the National Bank of Peru talking about being hit.
Hmm.
I mean, just hugely profound effect uh, in many places in Latin America. And so I
Yeah.
think it isn't that it's gone away; it's that the way it's being handled has shifted for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And what so we'll just get onto the other side of the policy side. What's the direction forward? Where do we need where's the ideal place that you see, where we get to when it comes to cooperation?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, so I mean, I have this thing about the fact that I think that we're in the second generation of
mhm,
cybersecurity as an industry, right? And I think that every generation looks at what the generation before did and thinks about how it build its own path forward. And the reality
mhm,
is, like, context changes, right? And what you do in reaction to that context changes. And the reality is that cyber risk is now too big and too costly and too impactful for our industry to remain the way it has been, where it's
mhm,
been niche and largely actually unbothered because people see us as so niche and so
mhm.
complicated, and they don't want to get involved. That's not going to fly anymore. What's
Yeah.
going to happen is things are going to come our way. Like, we're going to end up with professionalization of some kind being put on us. We're going to end up with regulation. Like, these things are going to happen, and
We're,
it's going to impact our industry very
yeah.
profoundly.
We're going to move into the whole, financial type of really kind of strict kind of, boundaries and checks and balances. I guess that's, we've seen regulation coming in
Yeah.
certain areas, but I think it's going to
And
become,
and like, look, we like to pout and
mm,
whine about it and say it's
yeah,
so unfair and no other area of technology has it. I mean, frankly, I think we won't be the other only area of technology that has it. I think
yeah,
AI will probably get it. But the
absolutely.
reality is this. Um, it actually professionalization is not uncommon. Lots of industries
Hmm.
have it, and it all comes down to the risk associated with what you do and the level of complexity, right? And so, I kind of take a view of, if it's good enough for doctors, it's probably good enough for us.
Yeah,
I don't know why we think we're special in that regard, but what we have as an opportunity is we can either be part of the process or we can not, right? And that
yeah,
means that we as a community, we have to stop the infighting. We have to stop, like, people in security come from a background of pointing out problems. We're
yeah.
not always great at pointing out solutions or suggesting solutions or having the patience to be part of creating a solution.
And we're also not great at listening in many times as well.
What?
That's that's the other side is that we do have to listen to the industries and the businesses in order to how we can help rather than
Well,
because we come at a very much to your point is that we're the enforcers. We like to here's what we need to be doing, but sometimes we sometimes are not as flexible as well.
yeah, I mean, going back to that original thing that I was saying at the beginning
Mm-hmm.
about it's such a crime to be non-technical in security, we have a habit of having a view that if somebody
Mm-hmm.
has different experience to us, that makes them intrinsically less knowledgeable rather than just differently knowledgeable. If I go and
Mm-hmm.
talk to somebody in the policy sphere and they're an expert on security, what am I doing there? I want
Mm-hmm.
them to be an expert on policy, which is not something that I am
Yeah.
an expert on, right? Like, I'm not an expert on the mechanics of how you create law. And I think probably most people in security aren't really experts on that. But what they
Mm-hmm.
are expert on is the piece of security that they work on or whatever they've got
Yeah.
experience of. And if they can bring that to the table and we can get other people who have expertise in law together, then we can create something potentially very positive. So when it comes to looking at things like certifications for our
Mm-hmm.
industry, we're the people who are going to be affected by them. So we're the people who should figure out which ones we like and which ones we
Yeah.
should take forward, or it'll get thrust upon us. So I think, I mean, in terms of where the future's going to go, my view is everybody who works in security
Mm-hmm.
has a choice to make about whether they want to play a role in determining their future or not. And I think if you
Yeah.
do, it doesn't have to be massive changes. You don't have to suddenly decide you're going to do my job. Please don't. I would like to be able to continue to do my job. I don't want to compete with everybody. Um, but what you can do is go, what are the little things that I can do? Like, how do
Hmm.
I communicate with non-technical people? How do I communicate with people outside security? How am I teaching people to fish rather than, and I'm not talking fish with a ph, don't go that far. That's too
Yes.
far. But how do I, rather than just being home IT for everybody in my
Hmm.
family and rolling my eyes and tutting and
How do
making
we get,
dismissive
yeah,
comments,
how do we
how
get
do I
the society around us more secure,
how do you
more
and you
thinking
said
about
at
it?
the beginning, you said we need better
Mhm.
communication.
Yes.
That's it. Like, how do we do a better job of having empathy and communicating with people in a way that rather than them going, oh, it's too complicated, it's too technical, and I don't want to know about it, instead they go, oh, that matters to me.
Mhm.
Tell me
Yeah.
more because it matters to me.
Yeah.
And that's the thing I think everybody can play a role in.
Yeah. I think it, well said, from when we talk about Miko Hippen and talking about that we're no longer, we're in a society, we're no longer just protecting computers anymore. We're protecting basically society. And I think that's the mindset we have to
Like,
get into and start thinking beyond the scope of kind of where we're coming from in the past, that what we do has a much more society impact today than it's ever done before.
couldn't agree
And
more.
it's not just a computer at the end of it, it's a service. And then that service could be, keeping people alive. It could be providing electricity to people's homes. It could be, you know, funding the whole financial industry. And, a lot of it, we have to understand that it's no longer just a computer or server. This has basically societal impacts. It's a service, and we're there keeping the lights on in many cases, and we have to look beyond the code and look beyond our techie kind of. I'm a geek at heart, but I always have to remember that at the end, this is providing some type of function or some type of service.
I could not agree more. And I think some people listening to this might feel like, well, I just want to do this as a job. I don't want that
Mhm.
responsibility on my shoulders. And fair enough. Like, that
Yeah.
actually is fair. You can't judge people for that. Fair enough. But the way I look at it is, isn't it also an extraordinary privilege to feel that you personally can have an
Mm.
impact on society in that way? And actually, yes, it's a heavy mantle to be a protector, but it's an extraordinary thing to know that
Yeah.
that's what you do with your time, is that you protect people. I think is incredible. So I
Absolutely.
I basically say to anyone who spends their time doing that and gives their time up, to protect other people, that you guys are awesome and we appreciate it. And keep digging in, find the ways to make people care
Mhm.
about what you do.
I think that's a fantastic note to start closing the podcast on. Jen, it's been fantastic talking to you, and again, I've learned a lot of things as well. As I mentioned, this is my favorite part of the week is getting to talk to awesome people.
Awesome.
So many thanks for spending the time. Any final words of wisdom that you would like to end
No,
with the
because
audience?
I talked too much already and I've taken too much of your time. So I'm just gonna leave it where it is and say thank you so much. This was awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen, for being on the podcast. It's fantastic, and for the audience. I mean, really, the perspective here is that at the end, it's all about being transparent and working together and finding ways that we can basically make sure that we communicate and have the common understanding of what we have an impact in the world's digital society. So, as it mentions, Jen's been awesome. For everyone in the podcast, again, tune in every 2 weeks for the 401 Access Denied. I'm the host of the episode, Joe Carson. It's been a pleasure. Stay safe, take care, and I'll see you again soon.